It was a cool, crisp evening when the golden lights of the Grand Vine, one of the city's most prestigious luxury restaurants, illuminated the quiet street outside. Nestled in the heart of the bustling downtown area, the Grand Vine was renowned not only for its exquisite cuisine, but also for its clientele. It was a place where the city's elites came to dine, discuss business, and enjoy an evening of fine dining away from the chaos of their professional lives. Every corner of the restaurant screamed opulence, from the plush velvet chairs to the polished marble floors and the intricate chandelier hanging from the high ceiling, sparkling like a constellation. The restaurant had long been the favorite haunt of influential figures, famous actors, and powerful businessmen. It was a space where the rich and powerful could mingle, discussing deals over delicate sips of wine or engaging in quiet conversation behind the heavy wooden doors of private rooms. The ambience was meticulously crafted to feel like a mix of serenity and sophistication, with soft classical music playing in the background, gently accompanying the clinking of silverware and glasses. Tonight, the restaurant was particularly busy. Waitstaff, impeccably dressed in crisp black uniforms and polished shoes, moved swiftly between the tables, ensuring each guest was tended to with the utmost care. The kitchen, a well-oiled machine, was working in perfect harmony, each dish leaving the culinary depths behind the kitchen doors with precision. Everything in this establishment was done with a sense of grandeur, designed to make each patron feel like they were in the lap of luxury. As the evening went on, the restaurant began to fill with a familiar crowd. The chatter of high-pitched voices, the hum of excitement about the latest gossip in the city, and the delicate swish of champagne flutes provided a lively soundtrack to the dinner. At the front of the restaurant, near the entrance, there was a large podium where the host greeted guests. This was the first impression of the Grand Vine, and it was important to ensure that all visitors felt immediately important the moment they arrived. Among the crowd of well-dressed patrons was one guest who, despite his modest attire, was about to become the center of attention in a way that no one could have predicted. Dressed casually in a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, the man entered the restaurant almost unnoticed. He wasn't a part of the usual crowd that the staff had been trained to cater to. He wasn't wearing a designer suit or carrying the air of someone who could purchase the entire restaurant in a moment of whimsy. This man was none other than Big Shaq. Big Shaq, the owner of the Grand Vine, had chosen to dine at his own restaurant that evening. He had always preferred to keep a low profile when visiting the establishment, not wanting to create unnecessary attention or disrupt the normal flow of things. He was, after all, the last person anyone expected to see walking through the door dressed like a regular person. But that was exactly how he liked it, being able to enjoy his own business without the weight of recognition constantly looming over him. His reputation as an entrepreneur, a businessman with a wide range of ventures, had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. Yet, he wasn't one to flaunt his success with flashy clothes or accessories. He preferred simplicity, choosing to wear what made him comfortable while still maintaining an aura of authority and confidence that spoke volumes without saying a word. His demeanor alone exuded a quiet power, but no one could have guessed that the man sitting in the corner booth, quietly reading through his phone, was the very owner of the establishment they were dining in. As he took his seat, Shaq remained unnoticed by the staff at first. After all, with his unremarkable appearance, no one could have possibly known who he was. The staff, busy with their tasks, continued to serve the more obviously high-profile customers who sat at tables near the windows or in private rooms. The restaurant was filled with guests, all of them well-dressed and part of the elite circle of individuals who frequented places like the Grand Vine. The scene was normal until it wasn't. The young waiter on duty that evening, a new addition to the team, was eager to make a good impression. Tom, in his late 20s, had recently joined the Grand Vine's prestigious service team and was determined to show his worth. He was the type of person who believed in status and appearances, the kind of guy who looked down upon those who didn't measure up to his standards. He had worked hard to land this job, after all, and he wasn't going to let anyone, especially not a casual diner like the man in the hoodie, distract him from his goals. Tom had quickly learned that the customers who walked into the Grand Vine were used to being treated like royalty, and for him, his primary objective was to ensure their experience was flawless. He wanted to make a name for himself in the restaurant world, impress his superiors, and move up the ranks. As such, he would always give extra attention to the patrons dressed in the finest clothes, the ones who flaunted their designer brands and seemed like they could tip thousands of dollars without a second thought. So, when he noticed the man in the corner booth, dressed so casually compared to the rest of the guests, Tom immediately thought that this was just another low-tier customer who didn't belong in such a prestigious place. Perhaps he assumed this man was a tourist who had no idea what he was getting into by coming to the Grand Vine. Tom's first instinct was to brush him off as insignificant, a typical response from someone who hadn't yet learned the true value of customer service. Tom approached Big Shaq's table with a slight air of superiority, his posture slightly stiffer than usual, as he prepared to address a regular diner. What happened next would change the course of the evening in ways no one could have anticipated. Big Shaq, who had been silently observing Tom's approach, looked up with a knowing smile but didn't immediately react. He let the waiter approach, his expression calm and unreadable, the subtlety of his true identity still hidden beneath the facade of casualness. Shaq had been in the restaurant business long enough to recognize the type of attitude Tom had. And while most people would have been offended by such arrogance, Shaq simply watched, knowing that his moment of reckoning would come soon enough. It was a night like any other in the Grand Vine, except, of course, for the fact that one man was about to experience the full force of karma in a way he never saw coming. The Grand Vine restaurant was bustling that evening, the hum of conversation filling the air as waiters glided between the tables, their shoes clicking on the marble floors. The fine dining atmosphere was what the restaurant was known for: opulence in every corner, delicate plates of exquisite food arriving from the kitchen, and guests who treated their meals as more than just sustenance. It was an experience, a statement of wealth, status, and influence. No one was ever meant to feel out of place here. Among the refined guests, Big Shaq remained an anonymous figure, blending into the background as he sat alone in his corner booth, his unassuming hoodie and jeans making him the least likely person in the room to stir up any drama. He wasn't a man who sought attention, yet as always, his mere presence carried a weight that others could never quite place. Tonight, he wanted peace and quiet, a few hours of respite from his empire building. But little did he know, his evening would soon take an unexpected turn. Tom, the young waiter, was new to the restaurant and eager to prove his worth. He had been hired just a few weeks ago, and already he had set his sights on climbing the ranks. He had read all the right books, watched all the videos, and studied the habits of the wealthiest patrons who visited the place. He knew how to charm them, how to flatter, how to present himself as someone worthy of being among the elite. He knew the names of the regulars, the celebrities, the politicians, and the business tycoons. And for someone like him, social status was everything. Tom didn't think much of the man in the corner booth at first. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, with his sneakers tucked under the table, he was clearly out of place in a luxury restaurant. He didn't have the polished look of someone accustomed to high-end dining. This man wasn't someone Tom recognized, nor did he appear to fit into the world that Tom had worked so hard to be a part of. In fact, Tom had a strong belief that people like him, those who came to places like the Grand Vine, deserved to be treated with a certain level of deference, a special kind of respect that ordinary people didn't quite warrant. Tom was sure this man had somehow wandered into the restaurant by mistake, maybe a tourist who didn't know any better, or worse yet, someone trying to infiltrate a world that didn't belong to him. He made up his mind right away. This man would not be getting the usual red carpet treatment. Tom would give him the minimum attention, just enough to get by. After all, in his eyes, someone who looked out of place could only be treated the same. As the evening progressed, Big Shaq sat in quiet solitude, focusing on his phone as he waited for his food. He'd ordered one of the signature dishes, a carefully crafted filet mignon paired with a delicate truffle sauce. Something simple, something comforting. He didn't need anything extravagant. This wasn't a night to draw attention. He was here to enjoy the food, the peace, and the quiet, far away from the stresses of business meetings and high-profile events. But Tom had other plans. The young waiter, now carrying a tray of drinks, passed by Big Shaq's table several times. Each time, he glanced at the man in the hoodie, feeling an internal judgment brew. It wasn't that Tom was particularly rude. It was just that he didn't take the time to notice the humanity in the person he was serving. He saw the exterior, the outward appearance, and that was enough for him to make assumptions. On his next trip to the table, Tom approached Big Shaq and, with an overly casual tone, asked if everything was to his liking. The words were polite, but the underlying tone of condescension was impossible to miss. Tom's eyes briefly flicked over the man's attire and then to the rest of the well-dressed patrons around the restaurant, as if to say, "You don't quite belong here." Big Shaq, still absorbed in his phone, glanced up and nodded. "Yes, everything's fine. Just waiting on my meal," he replied simply, his voice steady and unassuming. He didn't seem to notice or care about Tom's tone, but something in Tom's demeanor did not go unnoticed by the waiter. In Tom's mind, this was another one of those easy customers who would be happy with whatever they were served. So, without hesitation, he pushed forward. "That's good to hear," Tom said, keeping his tone light. "But, next time it's best to have reservations, especially on a night like this," he added with a smirk, expecting the man to apologize for his casual appearance, for what Tom perceived as an error in judgment, something that could be forgiven by a polite remark. But Big Shaq simply looked at him, his expression unchanging. The waiter, sensing the awkwardness of the situation, tried to laugh it off. "But no worries, we always manage to find a table for everyone, even those who don't look like they belong," Tom said, barely able to hide his condescending tone. At that, Big Shaq's calm smile didn't falter. He looked up from his phone and met Tom's eyes for a brief moment. His gaze was steady, calm, and yet filled with an energy that Tom couldn't quite read. Something about that look made Tom uneasy, though he couldn't place why. It was as if the man was aware of something Tom wasn't. "Is that so?" Shaq replied, his voice low but firm. He didn't seem rattled or defensive. He was simply stating the facts, in a way that somehow unsettled the waiter even more. It was the way he spoke that made Tom feel slightly off balance. But still, Tom carried on, thinking he was simply doing his job. As Tom moved away to tend to other tables, he laughed quietly to himself. This was just another opportunity to feel superior, to remind himself that he was part of the elite world that ran places like the Grand Vine. He shook off the strange interaction, dismissing it as nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. Little did he know, this moment would come to haunt him in ways he never imagined. It wasn't long before the incident would catch up with him. The reality of his words, the mocking tone that he hadn't even realized was dripping from his lips, would soon come crashing down on him. What Tom didn't know, however, was that the man he had so casually insulted wasn't just any regular customer. He was the owner of the very restaurant he worked in. As the evening wore on, the meal proceeded as expected for the other guests. But for Tom, a growing sense of unease began to settle in. He had no idea who the man in the hoodie truly was, nor the consequences that would unfold from his thoughtless words. But soon, the truth would reveal itself, and Tom's world was about to change forever. As the night stretched on, Tom continued to serve the other customers in his section. He moved with purpose, ensuring each guest had their wine topped off and their courses delivered without delay. Yet, there was a growing unease inside him, something he couldn't quite shake. Despite his initial dismissive attitude towards the man in the corner booth, something about the encounter kept nagging at the back of his mind. Perhaps it was the way the man's eyes had briefly met his, so calm and unbothered, yet still piercing in a way that unsettled Tom. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time that evening, Tom wasn't completely sure of the situation. The restaurant had been filled with the usual VIP guests, celebrity actors, wealthy businessmen, and well-known figures. It was no surprise to Tom when another group of high-profile guests entered, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. The air around them seemed to hum with the promise of exclusivity, and Tom was quick to adjust his attention. He greeted them with the professionalism expected of him, all the while allowing his mind to drift back to the mysterious man in the hoodie who had been sitting quietly in the corner. It wasn't until Tom returned to the kitchen to grab an order of dessert that the truth began to unfold. He was near the staff entrance when he overheard a conversation between two of his colleagues. discussing the night's events. The name Big Shaq caught his attention. "You know, the man in the corner booth is Big Shaq, right?" one of the chefs said to the other as they adjusted the plating of a delicate dessert. Tom froze, the tray he was holding momentarily forgotten in his hands. His heart skipped a beat. The words Big Shaq echoed in his mind as if someone had just dropped a bombshell. He wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. Big Shaq, wasn't that the name of the renowned entrepreneur, the owner of some of the city's most successful businesses? The name he had heard spoken in hushed tones at corporate events, and whispered around the city as the man behind some of the wealthiest establishments in town. The same Big Shaq who was known to own the Grand Vine? His head started to spin, his thoughts racing as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Big Shaq, the Big Shaq, was sitting at the very restaurant that Tom worked for. And worse yet, Tom had been the one to disrespect him. He suddenly realized the depth of his mistake, the gravity of his careless words. The man he had dismissed so casually, the one he had mocked in his mind for not fitting the typical profile of a luxury diner, was not just any guest. He was the very man who owned the establishment. Tom's stomach turned as he replayed the interaction in his mind. The way he had spoken to Big Shaq, how he had dismissed him so effortlessly, assuming he didn't belong. And the worst part, the part that made his skin crawl, was that Shaq had known exactly what was happening. He had seen through Tom's facade, and yet he had said nothing. It had been a moment of quiet judgment from Shaq, and Tom had failed to realize it. In that instant, Tom felt his entire world shift. All the lessons he had learned about customer service, all the knowledge he had gained about respecting guests and their status, suddenly felt hollow. The importance of humility, the idea that every guest deserved the same respect regardless of how they appeared, hit him like a ton of bricks. He had been so absorbed in his own ambition and desire to climb the social ladder that he had forgotten one of the most fundamental truths. Arrogance and assumptions had no place in the hospitality industry, or anywhere else for that matter. As Tom stood there in the kitchen, his colleagues continued to chat, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. His hands were shaking slightly, his palms clammy with the realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. He had spent so much time trying to impress the so-called elite guests, all the while forgetting the most important lesson. Every person, no matter who they were, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. At that moment, Tom knew there was no way to undo the damage he had done. He couldn't take back his words, nor could he erase the mocking tone that had laced his interaction with Big Shaq. But he also knew that the consequences of his actions weren't something he could ignore, not after learning the truth about the man he had disrespected. His entire approach to his job, and to the people he interacted with daily, would have to change. If he wanted to remain in this industry, if he wanted to succeed and grow, he needed to own up to his mistake and do everything in his power to make amends. Still, the sinking feeling in his stomach didn't go away. Tom knew that it wasn't just about making amends for a single interaction. It was about confronting the deeper flaws in his character. He had spent so much of his life defining his worth by the status of others, by the clothes they wore, and the money they had, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Humility, respect, kindness, they were the qualities that defined a person, not the wealth they flaunted or the title they carried. Tom had learned the hard way that wealth and status didn't make a person any more or less deserving of respect. In fact, it had been the very lesson he had needed to understand in order to become better at his job and, more importantly, become a better person. When he returned to the dining floor, his steps were slow, his mind still reeling. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled into his chest. The evening was winding down, the restaurant now less crowded, the conversations quieter. He knew he would have to face Big Shaq again, he had to. But how could he possibly make things right after his thoughtless actions? Was it too late for apologies? Would Shaq even accept them? As he walked towards the corner booth, his heart pounded in his chest. Big Shaq was still sitting there, relaxed, his phone in hand as he waited for his check. The man didn't seem angry, didn't seem to have any sense of urgency to address the awkwardness of their earlier interaction. He was calm, unruffled, as if he had expected this to happen all along. Tom took a deep breath and approached the table. He forced a smile, his voice shaky as he began to speak. "Mr. Shaq, I owe you an apology. Earlier, I made a mistake. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve, and I want to sincerely apologize for that," Tom said, his voice low and sincere. Big Shaq looked up from his phone and met Tom's gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of frustration. Instead, there was a quiet understanding. A flicker of recognition passed between them. Shaq had known all along that Tom hadn't recognized him. And perhaps even more importantly, Shaq understood the young waiter's internal struggle in this moment. The apology was the first step toward humility, and that meant something. "I appreciate your apology," Big Shaq said, his voice calm. "But next time, remember, respect isn't about what people wear or how they look. It's about who they are and how they carry themselves. Everyone deserves that, no matter where they're from or what they've achieved." Tom nodded, the weight of Shaq's words settling deeply in his mind. He realized that this wasn't just about saving face. It was about understanding a deeper truth. The lessons of respect, humility, and decency were more valuable than any title or luxury. And it was a lesson he would carry with him from that moment on. As Tom walked away from the table, his heart felt lighter. The tension in his chest had faded, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned something valuable, something that would not only make him a better waiter but also a better person. The evening had not turned out as he had expected, but in many ways it had turned out for the best. And as for Big Shaq, he simply returned to his phone, the man he had always been, calm, collected, and above all, wise. The following days at the Grand Vine were filled with a quiet sense of tension for Tom. Though he had apologized to Big Shaq in person, the reality of his actions lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the memory of his own arrogance, the way he had dismissed a man simply because of his outward appearance, unaware of who he truly was. It was a painful lesson, one that reminded him of just how easy it was to judge people based on superficial assumptions. As the days went by, Tom's colleagues continued to talk in hushed tones about the incident. They didn't know the full details, of course. Only the staff who had been present in the kitchen when the revelation came to light knew that Big Shaq had been the man sitting in the corner booth that night. To the rest of the team, he was just another guest, albeit one who had been treated less than respectfully by the young waiter. But the ripple effect of Tom's mistake was undeniable. Whispers about his behavior circulated among the staff, and the restaurant's reputation, built over years of meticulous service, was at risk. Tom had learned the hard way that when you work in such an environment, every action has consequences. The stakes weren't just personal, they were professional. One afternoon, after a particularly slow lunch service, Tom was called into the manager's office. His heart sank as he stepped inside. The manager, Mr. Reynolds, sat behind his desk, looking stern as ever. He had been with the Grand Vine for over a decade, known for his no-nonsense approach to service and his unwavering attention to detail. Tom had always respected him, but now, the weight of the situation made him uneasy. He knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Tom, have a seat," Mr. Reynolds said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Tom sat down, his palms slightly sweaty. He knew what was coming. "I've received a complaint," Mr. Reynolds continued, his eyes sharp as he studied Tom's face. "It's about your interaction with a guest last week. A regular here, Mr. Shaquille Thomas, the owner of the restaurant." The name hit Tom like a slap in the face. It felt as if the ground beneath him had just cracked open. He had hoped that his apology to Big Shaq would somehow smooth things over, but apparently, it hadn't been enough. The reality of his mistake was sinking in deeper now. "I've already spoken to Mr. Thomas," Mr. Reynolds said, his tone measured but serious. "And while he didn't want to escalate the issue, I've been instructed to make sure you understand the seriousness of what happened." Tom swallowed hard. He could feel his stomach churn with a mix of embarrassment and guilt. Disrespecting a guest, especially one of his stature, could have serious consequences for you and the restaurant, Mr. Reynolds continued. "But more importantly, this incident has revealed a fundamental flaw in your attitude. In this line of work, we don't just serve food and drink. We serve people. Every person who walks through that door, whether they're wearing a tuxedo or a hoodie, deserves to be treated with respect. Your behavior last week was not only unprofessional, but it was also deeply misguided. Tom nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his manager's words was more than he could bear. He had always prided himself on being a good waiter, polite, attentive, efficient. But this mistake had cost him something more valuable than just a good reputation. It had cost him his integrity. He had acted out of judgment, not out of service, and now he was paying the price. I've spoken with Mr. Thomas, and he's made it clear that he won't be pressing any further action, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice softening slightly. But let me make this clear. If something like this happens again, we won't be so fortunate. Understand? Tom nodded again, feeling the full weight of the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. He knew that this wasn't just about a single mistake. It was about how he carried himself in the future. The restaurant wasn't a place where second chances were given lightly. Mr. Reynolds was right. Every action had consequences, and in the world of high-end hospitality, those consequences could be devastating. I understand, Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Reynolds gave him a hard look before leaning back in his chair. Good. You're a young man with potential, Tom, but you have to start seeing people for who they really are, not who you think they are. If you want to stay in this industry, you need to learn the value of respect. After a moment of silence, Mr. Reynolds stood up. You can go now, but I expect to see an improvement in your behavior from now on. This restaurant has a reputation to uphold, and you're a part of that. Don't forget it. Tom stood up, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. He was dismissed, but the gravity of the conversation lingered in the air like a heavy fog. As he left the manager's office, the rest of the day felt like a blur. He carried the lesson with him, his every step weighed down by the understanding that he would have to prove himself again. Not just to Mr. Reynolds or Big Shaq, but to himself. The following days were some of the most challenging Tom had ever faced at the Grand Vine. Every interaction with the guests felt heightened, his awareness of how he presented himself more acute than ever before. It was as though his every word and gesture were under a microscope. He knew that people weren't watching him because they wanted to see him fail. They were watching because they had high expectations, and he couldn't afford to disappoint them. One evening, as the dinner rush started to pick up, Tom found himself standing before a table of guests who were clearly displeased. The food had arrived cold, and the wine had been served at the wrong temperature. Normally, this would have sent Tom into a mild panic, but instead, he approached the situation calmly. He knew what he had to do. He apologized sincerely, promised the guests a new round of drinks, and personally oversaw the correction of the errors. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it felt good. As the weeks passed, Tom started to rebuild his sense of self-worth. The lessons from his confrontation with Big Shaq and his conversation with Mr. Reynolds continued to shape his approach to his work. He made a conscious effort to treat every guest, no matter their background or appearance, with the same level of respect and care. His humility, which had once been a weakness, was now his strength. He wasn't just serving food anymore. He was serving people, each one deserving of his full attention and consideration. Then, one evening, as the dinner rush began to wind down, Tom was called over to the bar. It was none other than Big Shaq himself, sitting with a glass of wine in hand. Tom hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach him, but Big Shaq's smile was warm and reassuring as he gestured for Tom to come closer. I see you've been doing better, Big Shaq said, his voice steady but friendly. I've been watching you, and I can tell you've learned from the experience. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, Mr. Shaq, he said sincerely. I really appreciate the chance to make things right. Shaq nodded. You know, Tom, it's not about perfection. It's about growth. You made a mistake, but you're learning from it. That's what matters. Keep that humility, and you'll go far in this business. Tom couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Big Shaq wasn't just offering him words of encouragement. He was teaching him a valuable lesson about resilience, personal growth, and the power of humility. It was a lesson that would stay with Tom for the rest of his career. As Tom walked away, he realized that the most important thing he had gained from the entire experience wasn't just the forgiveness of Big Shaq or the approval of Mr. Reynolds. It was the knowledge that humility, respect, and hard work were the true cornerstones of success, no matter where you came from or what you had accomplished. In the end, those were the qualities that would define his career and the lessons that would shape his future in the world of hospitality.